Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Film Roundtable. I'm Maria Prieto, and I'm here to introduce our fantastic panelists as well as our guest moderator today. But before we dive into any of that, and many of you usual listeners know that we like to take a moment of silence before these conversations to honor all the COVID deaths that have happened in the last year, which as of today, January 16th, 2020, is 2,016,860 worldwide deaths. We also want to honor all of our Black and Brown brothers and sisters, as well as our First Nations brothers and sisters, whose lives have been taken by the hands of police brutality and other senseless acts of violence. Thank you. Thanks, guys. All right, so I'm going to introduce our guest today. We have Michael Goy, cinematographer and ASC member, joining us. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Hello. Good. Nice to be here.
Good, good. We have cinematographer Christian Sprenger. Hi, Christian.
Hello.
Good to see you. Cinematographer Tehillah DeCastro. Hi, Tehillah.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. And we have Steve Bellamy, the president of motion picture and entertainment at Kodak. Hi, Steve.
How are you doing?
Good, good. And finally, I want to introduce filmmaker Hannah Welever, who was absolutely crucial in organizing this discussion and will be our guest moderator today. Hi, Hannah.
Hey, Maria.
Yeah, no, well, seriously, thank you. Welcome, all of you. You are now part of the Film Roundtable family. And I'm going to pass this off to Hannah. But I just want to let the audience know that today this group is here to talk about film, specifically the importance of learning how to shoot on film within the film school environment. So Hannah, off to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Maria. And honestly, thank you all for being here today. I think this is a really important topic. And we have some really unique perspectives all here together. So excited to see where our conversation goes. As Maria mentioned, if you want to ask questions to the other panelists, let's keep this as open as possible. I do want to start off by saying that this panel was really a reaction, me organizing this panel was a reaction to finding out that Columbia College is disbanding their film program, not the full program, but teaching film cameras and the film teachings along with those cameras. They are almost completely phased out and will be fully phased out by the end of the academic year. Again, I confirmed with faculty members yesterday that this is sort of the state of film at Columbia College. Things will go to potentially a workshop, but they're getting rid of these tools that a lot of us have learned at the school. And I think this is a really interesting topic. Where is film going? What's the relationship in college film schools and education with learning these skills? And Steve, I really want to start with you. I'm curious, what's been going on at Kodak the last 5 to 10 years? Like, how have things changed? And there's definitely been this resurgence. I'm curious if you could just touch on that for us. Give us a little backstory.
Sure. Well, I would first say that if Columbia is stopping using film, then they are no longer a film school, they're a file school. And so they shouldn't pretend to be a film school if they're not using film. In terms of Kodak, we've had a meteoric kind of renaissance period of growth. Every single file format or film format, 8, 16, 35, 65 have all exploded in growth. And, there have been periods of time where our biggest problem is we can't make film fast enough. We've seen by far and away our biggest growth in 8mm and 16mm. And the next generation of artists, motion picture artists, that's where we are seeing the biggest growth. And that shows, occasionally we'll get a school that will do something stupid like this. And it really shows how just out of touch they are with the market. Because what happened was that the kids that started shooting at 240 and 360 resolutions, when video got to 4K, they're like, okay, this really, I know how to do this, and it's really gotten good. the kids that started at 4K couldn't care less about moving to 6K and 8K. That's absolutely meaningless. Those are the kids that are migrating back into film, or not back into film, migrating into film. And they are just finding it as an artistic tool that is unparalleled. And I mean, we are just dominating now on great young artists using the medium, especially commercials. We're getting commercials from the weirdest places ever, to where a brand will say, we want this shot on 16 millimeter. You know, before a brand could care less, it was usually the director that was making that choice. But it's completely changed. And we've got all kinds of announcements coming out here in the next 4 to 6 months that are going to speak to that.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't wait to hear about those. And this is great. I mean, Christian, could you talk to us about what your education at Columbia College was like, and what you were learning when you were in school?
Yeah, I graduated in 2007. And at the time, this was like pre 5D video, pre Red Alexa, you know, it was kind of pre really tapeless video in general. And our entire education was on film, aside from one digital cinema class at the very end. I think it was my last semester of my senior year, which was basically learning how to read waveform vector scopes, learning how to, you know, learning all the different, you know, what D5 was, and learning a little bit about digital intermediate. And then we looked at, we basically were taught the Sony F900 and the Varicam. But leaving film school, that was the only non-film format that I had really even played around with. And then when I graduated, there was, you know, DVX, HVXs that kind of became very popular, and then Red came out a year or so later. And but yeah, I pretty much didn't do any video whatsoever. I mean, there was, you know, some, I think directing students were doing some projects on like DV Cam, but for the most part, I was all Super 16 and then 35 in the last like 3 semesters of school.
Awesome. And yeah, that's very different than the experience of a lot of students today. Tehillah, I'm curious if you could share your experience at Chapman, because we talked a little bit about that, and sort of, you know, what were you shooting on at Chapman, and what was sort of the main, what were you mainly learning?
Yeah, I had an interesting time at Chapman because it was the period when seeing slowly less and less theses were being shot on film. I graduated in 2018, and so I grew up with, you know, Sony cameras and pretty much all digital, and we had little to no experience working with film, because a lot of the gear that was at the school was outdated, and or not necessarily outdated, but there was always problems with it, and there was no incentive for the school to fix it, because they wanted to, you know, stay current, because a lot of the films at the time for convenience were being shot digitally. So they thought, oh, we, you know, if all these films are being shot on Alexa, you guys should be conditioned to shoot on what's convenient and practical, because you know, when you're in school, you're trying to just be resourceful and use what you have. And even though we had gear at the school, like film, we had SR2s and an old scanner, they're all broken to a certain extent. And a lot of the funds that the school decided to use that for was to bring in new Sony cameras, or try and get Reds or Alexas.
Totally. And Michael, I'm curious, now that you've heard these two sort of more like recent, I guess, experiences of students, I'm curious what your experience was like at Columbia.
Well, I would say even before Columbia, it's funny, because when I hear these discussions right now, 70 years ago when I Love Lucy was in production, and the entire industry was laughing at Desi Arnaz because he was insisting on shooting I Love Lucy on film instead of videotape, which was the new hot thing, and everybody was converting to videotape. And, you know, why do you want to shoot on film? And I Love Lucy is one of the only maybe 1 or 2 shows that survives today, you know, because it was shot on film. But anyway, you know, when I went to Columbia College, and I was there from 1976 to 1980, what I liked about the experiences is very hands-on. You know, they put a Bolex and 100 feet of film in your hands on the very first day, and they sent you out to shoot a dozen shots that tell a story that means something to you, knowing full well that you would completely screw it up. But in the process, it eliminated your fear of failure. It eliminated the fear of making a mistake or getting an exposure wrong or whatever it was. And that lack of fear kind of carried me through the rest of my career. I was never afraid to take a chance doing something that I had never done before, because the curiosity of what I would achieve, you know, just overrode any fear that I had about doing something that had never been done before. So that was really kind of instrumental in my career and the development of who I became as a cinematographer and a director, quite honestly. So it's and you know, the film digital question, I mean, unquestionably it's important to keep abreast of things that are happening in the industry. I'm one of the co-chairs of the virtual production and virtual reality committee for the industry, and all of those things that committee is doing. But the fact of the matter is that film is not an invalid medium today. Film is a vital medium today, and it's short-sighted to not recognize the value, both artistically and I would say financially, that choosing one medium over another may give you. You know, like in the movie that I directed and shot, Mary, the costs of shooting film, 35 millimeter film, as opposed to shooting it on digital, came out dead even on that movie. You know, so the decision to shoot film didn't have to be predicated on a cost. It was predicated on what I felt artistically satisfied, you know, the needs of that movie and the logistics of that movie.
Yeah, I think you mentioned some interesting things here. I always think about when we talked a few weeks ago, and something stuck out to me, how you said, just shooting on film is quicker. And that's how you worded it. And I'm curious if you could sort of demystify that for any producers who might, you know, eventually be listening, and what that means to you.
Well, for me, it's a very fast process because it brings me back to, you know, light, camera, lens, and a roll of film. And I can shoot, and it eliminates a lot of the electronic chain that goes on. It eliminates the preponderant, you know, depending on video monitors, which I never cared for. I'd rather, you know, see things by my eye. So, you know, it's a very, very fast way for me to work, you know, and you know, I could not have gotten Mary done, you know, which is a movie starring Gary Oldman, taking place on a sailboat and shot in 18 days. I could not have gotten it done if I had not shot it on film, to be really honest. Under those conditions in Gulf Shores, Alabama, and hurricane season, you know, to be out there on a boat with digital cameras and connectivity to monitors and stuff like that, it was just not going to get done that way, you know.
Yeah, I think that film's a great example. I'm curious, Tehillah, I would love for you to tell your story about how you learned 16 and how you learned film after leaving school.
So once I graduated, I realized that because I hadn't had experience shooting on film, it limited me from the jobs that were coming up, because as Steve mentioned, there's kind of a demand for it. And I didn't want to lose out on any of those jobs. So I reached out to boutique rental houses in LA and asked if I could practice loading film and maybe shoot some passion projects on my own. But it made me realize that since I paid for film school, I wish I had done that, you know, in school. Because I was spending all my own money to try to get jobs post-graduation. And I think, you know, something that schools should try and bring back in is what Michael had experience with, where you were given a Bolex camera and to try to shoot projects that way. Nowadays, it's here's a Sony camera, here's monitors, so they're conditioning us to rely on these different sources, when I didn't learn this till after school, where when you shoot on a film, you're really trusting your instinct and you're going with your gut some of the times, and you're not questioning your decisions when you're staring at, you know, so many different monitors and waveforms. And yeah, and that kind of was my process, was kind of developing my eye and my instinct post-grad with just attempting film. I didn't really think about that when I was in school. I was just trying to be technical about everything. Whether I think with film, it taught me to be really intentional about my decisions, and especially the first few film projects that I was shooting, they were so low budget. So I think the atmosphere was completely different, where it's like, okay, we only have X amount of roles, everybody's on top of their, you know, job. And I think that was something that I really enjoyed, you know, that experience of everyone's kind of in it together, since there's so many limited takes.
See, and Tehillah, what the experience that you didn't have that I had was that when I was developing my skills as a cinematographer, nobody could look at a monitor and make a judgment of what I was doing until it was done and they had seen it. And, you know, today with the HD monitors on set and stuff like that, while you're in the process of doing what you're doing artistically, people will come up and comment on it, and people will say, what about this or what about that? And it's a really bad interruption of your artistic process and what it is you're trying to do and develop in your head.
I spent a lot of time on sets, and I can walk on a set, be there for about 5 seconds, not look at the camera, and tell you whether it's a film set or a video set just by looking at the people. If on a film set, there is a cadence. There is just hyper focus, like you can't believe. Then there's a break, then there's hyper focus. And when you go on a video set, it's just constantly rolling. And eventually all of the crew is looking at their phone, they're chatting, everybody's a director. You know, right now on these bigger productions, there are deep carts and monitor villages everywhere. And you see 10 directors on a movie where there used to be one. And it's made for a very bad motion picture process, in my opinion, but it's insanely definitive. I mean, you can walk on and in 1 second know whether it's film or video. And then I would also add something that Michael said about cost. The biggest myth in Hollywood is that film costs more. And I'm on the front lines of it. And I can tell you it costs less almost every single time. You know, line producers will look at a budget and say, oh, look, if we just cut out the film and the processing and the scanning, we save all this money. Yeah, but they never talk about everything that happens downstream from there. I start right at the camera. There's 800 fully depreciated 35 millimeter cameras sitting at Panavision today. I mean, you can walk in and rent those for so inexpensive. You have to get your money back out of an Alexa or a Red so quickly, because those things become paperweights a lot faster. But I mean, you can shoot a 50-year-old 35 millimeter camera and it's fine. I actually got some footage the other day that came from one of the Lumiere brothers cameras, and it looked stunning from like 1895 or whatever that year is. But when you're on a film set, sorry, I rescue dogs and they're all going bonkers right now. When you're on a film set, the movie is made in pre-production because there are stakes when you're rolling film. There's this illusion that the film costs so much money that you can only use a little bit of it. The reality is the most expensive component is people's time. And so when you have 40 people on a set and you spend 3 extra hours or 3 extra days, it's a very expensive thing. So with film, you know what you're going to do when you get on set. And what I notice on video productions, there's more wing in it. There's more trying a whole bunch of stuff. The shooting ratio on movie shot with film is so low and it's so high when you get into video. So almost always the amount of days you use to make a movie is going to be shorter on film than when you shoot on video. Then when you get into post-production, now you've got to find your movie in this needle in a haystack kind of situation where you've shot fourfold more principal photography, and you got to go find your movie. You got to pay people to do that. And then you get through all that and you pay a whole bunch of money to make your video look like film, which you could have just done in the first place. So unequivocally, I will state it is cheaper to shoot film almost every single time, but you will get kickback from line producers morning, noon, and night to that.
Yeah, you know, Keanu Reeves told me that the difference for him on acting on film or video was that the first video feature that he did, they never shut off the camera. They kept it rolling for 42 minutes. And while things were adjusted or the director walked in and gave him instructions, and Keanu said at one point, he said, can we just fucking cut the camera so that I can think about what I want to do and I don't have to worry that everything else is being shot.
I mean, I think there's a discipline that, you know, I think learning on film, especially when you're beginning to learn, you know, the process of what, you know, we have created as a film, you know, filmmaking on set, there's a discipline that I think even if you do graduate and even if you do go on and shoot digital, or you're going to shoot everything in, you know, VR or whatever, I think it still is an incredibly important discipline just for everyone, especially directors of photography, producers, to understand that, you know, the quality of the product that you're getting out of that discipline versus when you know, let the camera roll infinitely. And, you know, I think it's a ripple effect all the way down, like Michael's saying, to the actors, to the budget. And I think from director and DP standpoint, I think it really forces you to trust your eye. That I think now, you know, as cinematographers, for the most part, we are forced to trust a monitor. And, you know, if you have a monitor that you don't trust, then, you know, you're kind of shit out of luck. And I think in a lot of ways, you know, developing that trust for, you know, what you can see with your own eyes, developing an understanding of what film stock is capable of capturing, what processing is capable of developing. I think even if you don't go, you know, into a career where you're shooting a ton of film, I think it's so important as just the basis of an education to start there.
Yeah, I agree wholly. I may look like I hate video. I don't. I actually love video. I drive a digital car. I was friends with Steve Jobs. But I will say, when it comes to making motion picture art, I am so sold on film, it is ridiculous. And it comes down a lot to cost is one thing, but performance. And the performance is influenced by the word stakes. When I see a movie being shot on film, it really feels like every performance is they're stepping up to the plate at Yankee Stadium. And when I see something shot on a camera that's been rolling for 45 minutes, it feels like the minor leagues in Poughkeepsie with 19 people in the audience. And when you have stakes, that forces preparation, that forces focus, just there's this feeling of I've got to be great. And I think it shows in the art.
Yeah, and it's also, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Christian.
I was just going to say, you know, I do sort of feel like it is the responsibility of the educational system, or at least educators that, you know, are film schools, that it's important that we preserve that culture, because, you know, like Steve's saying, when an actor shows up to set, or a focus puller shows up to set and realizes that, you know, every take is literally valuable, and that if they don't bring their A game, they are literally wasting money if a focus puller ruins a shot, or if an actor, you know, flubs their line or whatever. I think it demands excellence from everyone. And I think that it's because we have this lineage of filmmaking where, you know, for how many years we've all, you know, shot film, learned on film, acted on film, produced film. But I think that if we lose that as a culture, it's scary to think what, how filmmaking may evolve away from that idea. And I think it's the responsibility of educators to help preserve that culture, help preserve that that idea that when you're going to a film set, everyone needs to be on their A game and everyone needs to do their best work.
Yeah, the movie business. Go ahead, Michael.
No, I just want to say, and to that point, I mean, part of the culture, what's changing right now is that cinematographers are intense off the set, watching a television. The creative process is happening on the set, and it's not just happening on the set when you're lighting it or setting it up. It's happening when the actors are performing it. And to have the cinematographer now removed from the set and sequestered in a black tent off to the side somewhere takes you out of the creative process that could be happening if you're standing right there on the set, where you can react to something momentary that's happening with the camera operator and the focus puller and with the actor and stuff. And that's a big change, I think, that's happening right now. That's detrimental.
That is so true. The movie business suffered because there is no commissioner of common sense across the board. So every single educational institution is just focused on how do we get our $75,000 per kid per year? How do we raise more funds? Hopefully one of these past directors can hit big so we can get them to donate a building. I mean, that's what they're focused on. The reality is we've come very close. Like right when I took the job at Kodak, I was basically commissioned to exit it. Can you get as much life out of this before it goes away in 18 months, 2 years? And God, thank the Lord, we've turned it around, but we were on death's door. And why that's important is there is no such thing as long-term digital archival. It's not a thing. You cannot depend on digital data to be there in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. That is a film thing. And, Michael can attest to what they found in Canada, with buried film that was over 100 years old that still plays, that was, frozen in tundra and frozen and thawed out 115 times. Film is very resilient. And, film is like a statue, and a digital capture is just zeros and ones magnetically held to a disc or some kind of a thing that's got to be, powered up for a long period, forever, for perpetuity, basically. And, go get an old computer and open it up and see if your JPEG's still open. I mean, digital data does not stand the test of time at all. It just doesn't. And so just for that thing alone, we should be fighting like crazy to make sure that film stays alive and healthy forever. And the educational institution should be at the forefront of that, and they are woefully lacking.
Well, I'll tell you, the very, very first feature film that I shot was a 16 millimeter movie called Moonstalker. It was a horror film. We shot it outside of Reno, Nevada. And there was a company that wanted to remaster it and put it out again. And all the video copies that they could find were just so horribly, downgraded in quality and were copies of copies and stuff like that. And I was able to track down the original 16 millimeter negative. So that movie right now is being remastered from the original negative, and it's going to look better than it ever looked on any of the video releases. So, I'm really excited about that. That's like a 32-year-old movie.
Yeah.
I have a counterpoint to that, which is that, as we approach the inauguration, I shot for the Presidential Archives in 2009 for Barack Obama's first inauguration. And, it was a week and a half of, documentary work following Obama and basically leading up to this historical event. And it was all shot Red 1 at the time, which was a new format. And the topic of archival came up, and, we turned all of our hard drives over to the archives, And then the producer that was working for Obama's inauguration, we backed all of our original files up to LTO, I don't know, 5 or 4, something like that. And not 6 months ago, I was contacted by that production company to help them recover the LTO tapes because they needed to go back in and get that footage. And we had the hardest time getting into those LTO tapes. We couldn't find functioning LTO decks that would were compatible with the tapes. We went through the manufacturer of the decks to try to find working LTO decks that were so outdated that no one was using anymore. And it was a sort of a shocking moment that at the time it was sold as this bulletproof way of archiving this super important footage. And here we are 12 years later, and we did end up finding a way to access it, but it was very fearful for 20 years from now, no one would ever be able to get into those tapes.
Film is just your eyes and God's light. It's a statue.
Steve, I have a question, sort of, jumping off of all of these points of how, and is Kodak incentivizing people to shoot? I know that there are some sort of deals with students, there's a discounted price, but I'm curious if you could talk about what those incentives might be.
Sure. The good news is that film is healthy. So many people are using it. The bad news is film is a very low margin product. There is just not a lot of margin in every foot of film that we sell. We are we're very, very green. And we'll get pushback sometime from producers. So say, oh yeah, Apple, for instance, yeah, we're going to stick with a digital camera just because of the environmental concerns. And it's by far and away more environmentally sound to use film than it is to use the alternative, by far. Cameras are used for 50 years. We recover all the silver. Our reclamation is amazing because we have to do it for film. We now do it for all kinds of other companies. And so we are reclaiming tons and tons of silver. So it's an amazingly ecologically friendly product. Whereas in the past it wasn't, when formaldehyde was used in processing and things of that ilk. But in terms of why I was going down that rant was, we are very exposed to the price of silver. We're very exposed to some prices of chemicals. And whenever you have kind of world instability like you have right now, where everything's sort of off the rails, pandemics, odd presidential situations, parties hating each other, that wreaks havoc on those types of markets. And some of our prices of ingredients have gone up double, in 3 months. And so there's not a lot of margin. So we don't do tons of deep discounting on film. That being said, we do everything we can to help people make their art. And it's not like there's resellers everywhere. It's us, there's myself and about 10 other people. Michael knows them all and probably has every cell phone on speed dial. And, we do all kinds of things to help people. Like, for instance, right now, Alejandro Inarritu has got a couple 100,000 extra feet of 65 millimeter film. And I'm on the phone all day long trying to find other people that can use that film, and they get it cheaper, and he has his situation work out fine. So we do have a small student discount. We incent like crazy. Lots of big directors like Chris Nolan and Patty Jenkins will make donations of their, they shoot millions of feet of film on their big movies, and then they will donate the extra film, and all kinds of pieces of art are made just on their remnants. So it's very cost effective to shoot film. It really is.
Yeah, I'm curious, based on our chat the other day, when I was working at Warren Miller, they had a few SR2s tucked in their cage that I was taking inventory. I'm curious if you have any fun insights with Warren's relationship with shooting on film, because that was really what they were doing, was lugging SR2s up on the helicopter to film people skiing off mountains. That's what they were using.
Well, ironically, so I was sitting in a bar in Denver with Warren Miller when he was about maybe 90. And he had lost his company to Time at that point in time. And he was in a big lawsuit with him. And so he was getting my advice on that. And he basically said, you ought to make these movies. And so I did. And that year I made a ski film. And the next 6 years, I made ski movies. And The Story and Winter were kind of like the two big ones I did. And they were literally based off of Warren just kind of daring me to do it. You know, if you watched his movies and then you went forward with Time, it very much echoes film versus what has happened in our digital world. You know, in the beginning, it was him with a hand crank 16 millimeter camera, meeting people at a ski resort, forming personal relationships, editing a movie himself with a small little crew, and then literally doing a road tour where he was the narrator in person. So he would narrate the movie while it was playing to these big audiences of thousands of people. And then as you went forward through the lifespan of that company, it ended up where the movies were basically digital product placements, to where, you know, Warren Miller Entertainment would go to the Tahoe Ski Association, get paid a couple of $100,000, and then go do a fake ski segment that's really a veiled commercial. And so you'd have 10 commercials strung together. It was called a movie. And it went from this magical, amazing thing to this absolute, just painful to watch. How much longer do I have to sit in this theater experience? And it reminds me so much of going to the theater pre-COVID. You know, I've been to, I won't name the theater because they're friends of mine, but I went to a theater in Santa Monica 2 days in a row where the DCP failed, and there ended up being an Apple screen on the movie theater screen, and a mouse came out, went down to the bar at the bottom, and reset the computer 2 days in a row. In all of my years of going to movies, I had one instance where a film projector broke. It was in Mammoth, California, watching, ironically, a Warren Miller movie. And there were flames coming out of the projection booth. We were all like, oh my God, the theater going to burn down. And 10 minutes later, somehow miraculously, we were watching the movie, and we missed just a little bit of it. In the first 18 months, when it switched to DCPs, there were 7 major malfunctions in movies that I went to. And to this day, I see tons of malfunctions in movie theaters on digital apparatus. And it's changing. And everybody I know that owns a theater is crying because, you know, they were tricked into with those VPLs, virtual print fee VPFs. You know, they were tricked into buying these digital projectors. And then 15 minutes after they're all up and running, all of a sudden, here's the new 3K or the new 4K. And then they're being forced to move up. You know, when you had an analog projector, you'd have a 50, 60, 7-year-old projector. You'd spend $18 a year on oil. You'd spend $1,500 every year and a half on a new bulb set. And that was it. And you never had a breakdown. The digital projectors, you know, these people are having $3,500 sales or technical calls, you know, every month, trying to fix these things and keep on the road. So it didn't help the movie experience, and it certainly didn't help from a cost perspective. And if you look, if digital projectors and digital apparatus was going to really make movie making less expensive, and it was going to be less expensive all the way down the chain, why in the hell did the price of movie tickets triple when we went from analog to digital? Sorry, I went on a rant there, but lying out of his.
You got to come over when we get this COVID under control, Steve, because I just got my 35 millimeter projector, and I just got an IB Technicolor print of Oliver. So along with my prints of Bambi and Fantasia and a bunch of other films. So.
Well, I think Steve was on an interesting track about sort of like reliability in as far as machinery. I'm curious if anyone has any examples of when things maybe weren't working properly on the digital front, or film was more reliable, or even vice versa, just reliability in general with the equipment.
I'm talking too much, but I have a great story after somebody else does theirs.
Launch into yours, Steve.
Well, I can't name a name, but there was last year, I got called by someone who was going to shoot film. They didn't. They ended up shooting their movie on one of those other camera brands. They had one scene in their movie that was a weekend that they had that set for 2 days. And then after that, it was gone. They could not replace it. It was like day 28 of a 34-day shoot. On Monday, for some reason, all 3 sets of drives had no data on them. They don't know why. They could not recover them. They had to pause the movie. They had to go back and rewrite the entire movie. They lost their cast, and the movie didn't have the most important part of the entire movie. And they had to duct tape, masking tape, and put a movie together. I won't name the name because they're not happy about the situation. I'm not going to embarrass companies, but that would not have happened if they were shooting film. And believe it, I let them know that. It just wouldn't have happened. We don't have those types. There's problems with film. Film kicks back. Sometimes you'll get, we've got some little dots over here. We've got a hue or something like that. It's usually you fix it in post. And there's an organic wrestling with film that occurs. It's just part of it. I love movies that have those sort of happy accidents in them. I love those images that aren't perfect. I love light leaks. I love film burns when they're organic and they really happen. I hate it when people fake them in post, but I love when it happens organically. And so you do have that, but you never just get skunked like all our data is gone. That just doesn't happen with film. You never, the camera won't turn on for some reason. Usually it's like a screw broke and it's an analog thing and you go fix that. But so that's my story.
Yeah. And I think there was this like myth that was sold to everyone that like solid state media was going to be the safest, most reliable way of recording and storing. But I feel like even with, like CFast cards are a great example. Like, a lot of the Alexa minis use CFast cards, but I've had so many issues with CFast cards in the last couple of years, likely because they've been in rotation for so long, and the rental houses are not keeping track of how many times they've been used, or what temperature they've been they've heated up to at whatever point. But I've had I would say in the last 2 years I've probably had half a dozen circumstances where we've lost a card, or we've had to send it out for recovery, or a hard drive has failed, or I think in the beginning it was sold as this like way safer thing than videotape, way safer than film stock, and I think it's a total myth.
Well, that's for sure that's a myth. And I mean, one angry employee with a magnet in his pocket just entire card. But if you look, I'll make a notice here about, as I look at the analog companies, everybody that's working at Panavision or Photocam or these analog companies, they're like on their 39th year. You go to Kodak, and there's people in Rochester that have literally worked at Kodak for 50 plus years. When I meet people in the digital world, it's like I've worked at 9 companies in 7 years. There just isn't there's not the connectivity between what you're doing. And so what I notice is that leads to just deception and lying. You're trying to sell as much as you can, as fast as you can. And if you take projection, for instance, in the very beginning, I mean, the digital projectors were so bad, they were unwatchable, yet all the posters were like, in digital, digital presentation. They might as well just said, we've raised the prices double for no reason, and pretend it's a sale. But that's what they did. I mean, just blatantly lied to the customers, and customers were dumb enough to buy into it. It was
I was interviewing for a feature film one time that was a nighttime movie, action movie, a lot of huge fireball explosions. And I told the producer that, we should shoot film. because, you know, I wanted the medium that would capture really the detail and the depth and the color and the vibrancy of all those explosions. And they went with another cinematographer, and they went with digital. And to that producer's credit, she called me. She called me on the phone and she said, we are having to paint in all the details and animate all the details in the flames, because what we have are complete whiteouts because all the files clipped on these explosions. She said, I didn't listen to you. And I just remember that. And it's like you try to give people advice and guide them as to what is the reality as opposed to what is the myth. You know, and this applies to productions, producers, it applies to film schools and everybody else. But, you know, sometimes they get blinded by what other voices who are not as well informed are telling them. And it's really the cinematographers that have to lead the charge, you know, in terms of what makes the most sense for the project that you're working on.
I'm sure you would agree with this, Michael. There has been digital technologies have brought a marginalization of cinematographers and of talent. They just have. And also, I think that's across the movie business. So I can tell you that if I'm sitting in Warner Brothers or I'm sitting in Disney or some studio, it's all Hollywood people. And there is definitely a sense of respect for artistry, for artists, for directors. When I'm sitting in the more Silicon Valley company offices, there is absolutely no respect for artistry, for artists. It's just a different mentality. It is, you know, the digital world works in obsolescence. You know, if I'm a software company and my software version 11 comes out, pretty much 10, 9, 8, 7, everything is dead. It's all about 11 and everything else is killed. That doesn't happen in our world. When acrylic paint comes out, that doesn't mean that you kill oil paint. You know, if we don't, there's some movies that are perfect for 16 and some that are perfect for 65, but Chris Nolan loves 16. He wouldn't say, oh, I only shoot on 65 now. It's whatever the art works for. But you'd never go and say, gosh, this really feels like a 2K movie, not a 4K movie, or I need to shoot this in 720p as opposed to 4K. It's just pixels. It's just a rigid grid work of boxes. And so it's just a big difference, the digital and the analog world.
I think talking about obsolescence is, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, Christian.
No, please.
I was just gonna kind of segue into this sort of like social media, maybe people don't like talking about it, but there is like this element of like nostalgia that modern social media and even big brands are attracted to, the look of film, right? Or like a Polaroid filter, some sort of like old school imagery over an iPhone photo. And a lot of brands, big brands, are willing to pay for shooting on 16 for their commercials, or wanting to spend time in post making, you know, their mini footage looking like 16. So I'm curious, like Tehillah and Christian, I think you both have had experiences with brands and sort of them wanting that look. And then I'd love to segue over to Michael talking about American Horror Story and what that look means to the show. But if Christian or Tehillah, you have an example of working with a brand or commercial projects where they're coming to you maybe saying that they want to shoot on 16, or Christian, I know you shot a few commercials last year on 16, and how was that relationship?
Yeah, I'm actually on a campaign right now that is a fashion brand, and they've shot the last like 2 or 3 years on film, and the directors, we're doing a simultaneous like photo stills campaign and a film campaign, and she's shooting all her stills on film, and it's kind of stipulated by the brand. It's sort of like becoming part of their identity. They're a very high-end fashion brand, and I think that film in some circles is sort of like a little bit of a bragging rights for certain ad agencies and certain companies out there. I do, you know, there's definitely several agencies I've worked with that, you know, they sort of have a highbrow, like, you know, everything we do is on 35 or, so yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. I think going back to what you're talking about social media, I think it's quite possible that what we're seeing, you know, this kind of resurgence of people's interest in film could come from the fact that there is a generation that is being bombarded by digital images that never had film, you know, references growing up, or, you know, at the beginning of the internet. And I think through things like, you know, Instagram, initially Instagram was like all these film filters that you would put on your photos. And then I think people started shooting higher res photos and doing, you know, more Photoshop processing. And then I think it kind of just jumped into the coolest thing you could do was to shoot on film. And I think in some ways, a lot of that has translated into like the commercial and music video world where, you know, people realize that this is a medium that's still very relevant and also kind of gets you some extra cool points in many situations, which I think is perhaps a happy accident, but it's quite wonderful that I think that's happening. And the other thing is, I think I've also been on a lot of projects where, you know, we have some form of restriction or can't convince a studio or a producer to shoot in film, and then we end up printing the film in post to basically try to sort of cheat that film look back in. And I think that maybe is worth discussing the point that, like, even if you are shooting digital, at least in all of my work, you're adding film grain back in, you know, in post. If you're printing to film, you're hoping to sort of shift everything back into like Kodak color science. You're hoping to, you know, get all of these more organic artifacts in your highlight roll off or in, you know, blooming of, you know, a film print. And I think film is this language as filmmakers that is sort of like the base that everything is sort of based on. I mean, every time I'm using a digital camera, I'm using film emulation LUTs, you know, to process my dailies. That's usually where most of my DIs get, you know, start, is with film emulation LUTs. So, you know, I do think it is this thing that's deeply embedded into the soul of you know, the global vernacular of filmmaking.
Can I add one thing you said there, Christian? And if you look at the DNA of anything digital, is the pixel. And in the course of our day, we are looking at pixels right now on our computer screens, on our television sets, on our iPhones, on our pads, on our bank records, on our medical records. We're just bombarded all day long with pixels. There's no way that there's not a pixel overload going on inside us when we're seeing 10 hours of pixels a day. There's just no way that's not the case. And it's the reason why museums are, you know, pre-COVID, were absolutely killing it. I mean, you make a museum and you're going to be successful. Look across the country right now. More money is poured into museums. You go to the Getty at Tuesday at noon and you can't get a parking spot, even though they've got 80 football fields of parking. We're not looking at pixels when we go in there. You know, there's digital ticketing, there's digital things, but you're looking at things that are organic. And you're also seeing movements to bicycles in downtowns and organic foods. And there is definitely, we have been over commercialized in all parts of our being as human beings, as people monetize things to preposterous extremes. And I'm telling you, we did that with this whole digital thing. Brought the whole ship down there with that one, huh?
I think for me, how I started getting work shooting on 16 was a little bit of a similar process with what Christian was mentioning about how photographers have been recently shooting a lot with their 35mm cameras, and brands musicians, different artists are, you know, seeing it as an attractive look where things feel more organic. And so if there was, you know, a brand that wanted to shoot on 35 stills, I would normally come in and maybe do the BTS portion on 16 so that it was on par with how it looked. And I think, you know, different ad agencies are getting accustomed to that standard, I guess you could say, of the film look, especially since I grew up in a world where there's just so much overconsumption and instant gratification with social media that they're always looking for what's new and cool and different. And I think it's great that, you know, it's giving me an opportunity and younger cinematographers a chance to try the medium. But again, it is just kind of a tool to see how much you can push your artistry. What I really enjoy about shooting on film is comparing how it takes light. I know it's such a simple thing, but when I was lighting on digital with monitors, I didn't really think about, you know, how far I can push it with hard light or soft light. And you can kind of see that when a lot of artists and musicians are posting their stills or album covers that are now being shot on film versus how it was maybe like 5 years ago when it was shot on a 5D.
It reminds me, that same subject reminds me of miking a kick drum. You know, when you mic a kick drum with a tube mic, I mean, you can just hit it as hard as you want and it just never clips, never breaks away. There's just, it's like infinite. And, you know, when you put it through a DAW with a digital microphone, it's not the same. It just doesn't have the same compression and the same depth. And I will add, on that subject matter with terms of music, where you got visual art and audio art happening at the same time. We are just seeing so many Sam Damasheks and Connor Brashiers. And yesterday I was just communicating with Phineas, who just bought 2 35mm cameras and he's shooting. All of these people are migrating to film, and it's because they understand it's just flat out better. Yes, it's cool. It's kind of avant-garde industry now, but it's just better. The images come out so organic.
I think there's also something in terms of young cinematographers and young filmmakers from the perspective of being an artist. I think that, you know, personally, and this, I guess Michael kind of touched on this in the beginning, but, you know, I think in the beginning of your career or of your education, you're constantly second guessing your choices. You're trying to develop that eye and that gut instinct. And I think, I mean, I feel like I have this experience every day on set where I am looking at an image and then immediately judging it because it's on a 17-inch monitor, which I think in the first point is that when you're making a film, you shouldn't be making all of your decisions based on a 17-inch version of your image. And, you know, ideally you'd be looking at your dailies on a projector, which is rare these days, I suppose. But I think by removing yourself from this dependence on a digital image or a monitored image, I feel like you kind of free yourself from that criticism, from that self-criticism, and you sort of are encouraged to take those risks and, you know, maybe explore or do something that you otherwise wouldn't do if you or your entire crew are sitting there and judging, you know, the decisions that you're making, live in front of an entire film crew behind you. I think that it just frees you up as an artist, and as a student. I think that it's an important way to sort of develop that voice that you're going to be relying on for your entire career. And it teaches you to trust a meter and trust your instincts and not trust, you know, the pixels that you're being shown.
I'm sorry, I'm Arnold Horshack from Welcome Back, Kotter and talking all the time, but Michael, you'll be the only one that gets that reference. You guys have to watch a movie called Bait, and it's going to speak to what you just talked about, sort of the artfulness of it. So Mark Jenkins made this movie where he shot it black and white on a hand crank 16 millimeter camera. Every single thing was on one take, and he obviously recorded no audio. He learned to read lips, and then he went in the edit bay and edited by reading the lips. Then afterwards, he brought the actors back in and they voiced it. In the processing of that, he hand processed every single foot of film himself. Obviously, there wasn't that much of it because everything was one take. And on one day where there was a lot of pollen, he left the door open and let the pollen sneak in the lab. He wore a wool sweater on one day and let those fall off into the bath. And what you see, like you could Google it right now and see the trailer, it's so stunningly artful and original. And it really, he's got a signature now that is like Keith Richards playing a guitar lick. I mean, it is so amazing. And it literally cost nothing. And it was because he used a medium that wasn't locked in a grid work of rigid pixels. It was something that's organic.
Yeah, I told Steve one time, he's had me tell it to several other seminars, that on American Horror Story one time, they wanted a sequence to look like Nazi fetish porn movies from the 1930s. And so I took 16 millimeter black and white reversal film and I unspooled it on the darkroom floor. I tossed it around like a salad. I sprayed water on it and I dried it with a hair dryer and I flashed it with a flashlight and I rolled it back up onto a core and I shoved it into a hand crank 16 millimeter camera and shot it. And that footage looked exactly like 1930s Nazi fetish porn movies. And it was a completely organic process and fast and simple. And with American Horror Story, there was a time, the 5 years that I was a cinematographer, one of the colleges that had film courses asked me to come and speak about how I achieved in post-production the look of the show. And I said, well, the look of the show was achieved at the time that I shot it because I shot it on film. So the normal look was 35 millimeter, regular processing, very clean, immaculate. People look great. If I wanted it to look slightly desaturated for a period tone, I would pull the processing 2 stops. If I wanted it to be in black and white, I shot it on black and white film. If I wanted hyper real colors and deep contrast, I shot on reversal film. If I wanted it to look like a remembrance of somebody's past, I shot it on Super 8. If I wanted a 1970s documentary look, I shot it in 16 millimeter and I underexposed 3 stops and I overprocessed 3 stops. So it was all done in the camera at the time that I shot it and not in post-production.
And you as the cinematographer controlled that as opposed to, a VFX team or, an editor or a colorist. You were the author of all those decisions.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And the thing is, especially like in television and episodic television, the delivery dates are so close to when the show is going to go get on the air. And a lot of times you're working as the cinematographer, you can't get into that kind of minutia of detail to control that look. I shot one pilot one time and there was a flashback that they wanted to look like Super 8. And I said, well, great, we'll just shoot it on Super 8. And they said, no, we'll make it look like Super 8 in post. And for 3 days, they messed with that footage, trying to make it look like Super 8 and complaining that it didn't look organic and complaining that it didn't look real when they could have just shot it in Super 8. So these tools, these things that we as cinematographers we use for a purpose, for an artistic purpose, certainly, for the convenience and the speed with which we can work with a particular medium in a particular situation, and also for what is actually right for the production from a cost standpoint and as well as the artistry. And it's important that we fight to keep that voice in the mix and not have people who are not as well informed as we are about the usage of these mediums, take over all those decisions.
No, they're taking over. That's for sure. And I would add as an aside, there's hundreds of people that are responsible for there still being film in the top 5 of those people, you've got Chris Nolan, P.T. Anderson, Quentin Tarantino, Patty Jenkins, and Michael Goy. Definitively, Michael was absolutely at the tippy top of that sort of friends of film meets friends of common sense of cinema, who was fighting in the trenches when so many things were going wrong for the medium.
Thank you, Steve.
Mm-hmm. You need an award.
I got to text Quentin and let him know that I'm competing with him.
Goy 3, Tarantino 4.
With that in mind, Michael, I am curious about sort of your perspective of television's relationship to shooting on film. I mean, there's limited shows that are shot on film. Some mini series, I guess. I wouldn't consider those television shows necessarily, but yeah, what are the Suits saying, or what's their relationship with film when you're talking to them about those decisions?
Well, and I think Steve would agree with me. Right now, at this point, there's an assumption that a production is going to be digital, unless somebody brings up, shooting on film and why. It's that process of having to justify why this particular medium, would be better for this show. And, it depends then on how willing they are to listen. I was fortunate on American Horror Story when I was shooting, because that question did come up. It came up in season 2 of American Horror Story. Can we change the show to digital? And I told them, film and what I can do with film and the look of film is going to be one of the signature things about this show, and they sat out, and watched during season 2, and then they saw what I meant. They saw the response of the audience and stuff, and then they didn't ask me that question again, So that's the atmosphere we're in, though, in television. Is it's just an assumption of digital. And I don't know, Steve, if you've heard anything different.
So I will tell you this. The only way a television show ever ends up on film is if the director has the gravitas to say, this is what I'm doing. If you don't want to do it, I'm out. Cinematographers are largely irrelevant unless the cinematographer has the ear of the director. So I spend most of my time with the directors. But right now, especially with HBO, we have a very, very film-friendly entity there. And you've got Westworld is on film. You've got Succession on film. Adam McKay's got a new series that's shooting on film. Euphoria just switched from video to film. And then that director, Sam Levinson, just shot a movie on film that's looking like it's going to be an Academy Award winner this year, or at least in the hunt. So they are fantastic. The streamers, it's been a very much of an uphill battle. And if I'm dealing with the person that's on tippy top of the streamer, they usually have enough common sense. It's the middle people that are just doing the basic blocking and tackling that are just so anti-film, it's ridiculous. They just don't get it, and they don't want to. They don't care about art. And there's one thing that I seem like I'm a crazy film guy here. The reality is I love all sorts of motion picture, and I love video, and I shoot video all the time. But I tell people not to shoot film all the time as well. And it comes down to one question. Are you making art, or are you making product? And if you're just making product, you don't need to shoot film. Film is easier in some ways. It's also harder. It kicks back. With film, there is struggle. You might get a light leak. You might get a this. You might get a that. You're not seeing what's happening on set, or you're seeing it through a 1080 monitor. And so if you're not a great cinematographer and you're just kind of going through the motions, film's not for you. But if you want to make art and you want to make timeless art that stands the test of time, shoot film.
Well, I'll tell you, Steve, on Mary, we shot all those thousands and thousands of feet of film on a sailboat during hurricane season. I never had one one bad batch. I never had one misprocess. And we were shipping the film out to Photochem in Burbank from Gulf Shores, Alabama, and not one incident.
Yeah.
No dust, no nothing.
That's fantastic. On that subject matter, we do 100 movies a year, and 2 or 3 of them will have an issue, and we jump in, and we have the best color scientists in the world, and when there's a hot potato, we're all over it. But I will say in general, because I have no problem owning the difficulties of our medium when there are them. And obviously, you have someone talented like Michael, you don't get them. But if you go through the pantheon of great art throughout the history of humanity, struggle is a inherent part of those, of making a Beatles song. John and Paul didn't always get along. It was hard making those. Recorded in Strawberry Fields, recorded at 2 different tempos and paces and cut together and made work. The Sistine Chapel was not easy to make, but with struggle usually comes those things that end up standing the test of time. And I'm noticing a world where we just don't embrace adversity. It's kind of we want every kid in the soccer place to get a trophy, as opposed to letting someone shed some tears and have a little bit of pain every once in a while. But I do notice that great art inherently has a great relationship with struggle. The ones that are the hardest to get over the line, and then they end up being masterpieces.
Well, speaking of struggle, then, my script Guthrie.
Yes.
Yes. I'm this close right now. It's probably happening while I speak to signing my lead actor. If that happens, April and May, I'm going into production. So I'm going to need 5219, and I'm going to need XX negative, because
Nice.
That's what I'm going to shoot that movie on. So,
yeah.
So start making it.
Yeah. Where are you shooting that movie?
We haven't decided if we're going to actually shoot in Guthrie, Oklahoma, or if we're going to shoot somewhere in California or New Mexico. That's being talked about right now.
Gotcha.
Well, Steve, I think your previous comment, I feel like we only have a little bit of time left here, but I'm curious if everyone could I'm all about sort of the call to action, what is, everyone is very passionate about this topic. So what is sort of our responsibility as filmmakers and cinematographers and, emulsion freaks to sort of keep the ball in the air? I feel discouraged knowing that colleges are getting rid of it, because those are the people making our ACs. Those are our loaders. Those are people that we're, inevitably going to hire, or even our gaffers. So what do we want the next 5 to 10 years to look like?
Well, I would say the 2 reasons why you want to fight for film are because there will be no longevic record if we don't have film, and you make better art with film. So I fight for choice of motion picture artists, because I want them to be able to decide. If someone says, I'm going to shoot in 8K, hallelujah, I couldn't be happier for them. I just want them to be able to have that choice. But to get that choice, when entities make ignorant decisions like those types of schools, it's simple. Don't go to those schools. Drop out that day and change schools and go to one that does. Tell every young person under no circumstances go to that school. And that's impactful.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly short-sighted from an education standpoint, or from obviously a for-profit college standpoint, because I do think there will be a time where people make decisions to go to film school based on the fact that they shoot film. Certainly, anytime I get an email from someone who's asking what film school should I go to, that's one of the first things that I say is make sure that you're going to a film school that has film in the curriculum. And I think it's foolish. I think a majority of digital print art is probably done with Adobe Photoshop, but it doesn't mean that if you go to school to learn Photoshop that you don't first learn what actual paint and paint brushes are and how to use them first. Even if you graduate and are learning everything digital, I still think it's important that film is part of a curriculum. And certainly I don't think film is going away anytime soon as a medium. We're witnessing this unbelievable revolution in technology for digital imaging. And yet, I'm shooting film all next week. So I don't think it's going away. I think it's something that obviously, organizations and education has a responsibility to try to preserve it just as much as, directors and cinematographers do.
Yeah, I would also add to that. I would challenge everyone to say the following. There's no such thing as shooting in digital. Digital is a technology, just like analog is a technology. The medium is video. You can either shoot on film or on video. You can't shoot on digital, just like you can't shoot on analog. And then two, it isn't a film school if they're not shooting film. It's a file school, period. I once did I've said that to some pretty big groups of people, and in the beginning it was sort of ballsy. And I was rolling the dice until I did one with Chris Nolan. And I think it was at Sundance, and somebody asked him a question, and he referred to them all as camcorder users. And so I think, all right, I'm fine calling people file makers if he can say that. And I got file makers actually from Denzel Washington, who's the one who said, I'm a filmmaker, not a file maker.
Tehillah, you want to?
Yeah, I just don't think it's fair to deprive, students, especially at such a pivotal point of, your artistry where you're so malleable, that if someone had an experience like me where it was pretty much purely digital, and here I am, hearing about bigger films who say that cost is, pretty much equivalent to digital. I just think it's important that schools realize that the atmosphere that film creates is really important too. And I don't think that's stressed enough, where it's kind of seen in a bad light, where delayed gratification is seen in a bad light, where it's like, oh, you're not seeing what you're doing right away, so it's better to just experiment it, because since you're experimenting with the resources that are immediate, you need to figure it out now. Whether, schools need to condition artists and cinematographers, and even in all fronts, not just cinematographers, that there is time is valuable, and that schools shouldn't feed into what social media is curating, with that quick gratification and quick consumption and watching all the seasons of something so instantly. And yeah, I learned that after graduation, and I wish universities would just allocate money to maintain the gear that they already own. I don't think it's that difficult to send out the SR2s and to get the scanner checked out, and have a course where students can practice 8mm or 16mm, and how Michael had his classes back in the day, because that's something I would have found so valuable.
It's funny how these institutions are so out of touch. I was at the TikTok house recently, where you have, or the Hype House, where all the TikTok stars live. And you have one kind of main image capturer, Bryant. And you have two people there that have, one person has like 101 million followers, one person that has 70 million followers, and all the image capture is on film by one guy, Bryant. And Sam Domashek and Connor Brechier and all of these, the hottest, coolest people that are capturing images, they're all shooting film. I mean, the school should be sprinting to go do what's on the cutting edge instead of being on the trailing edge. But they're so out of touch.
Well, I think I only have 140,000 TikTok followers, so, so I'm way behind. But it's about, what was it, 6 or 7 years ago, Steve? You asked me to speak at the luncheon for, I think, the HPA conference.
Yep.
And it was a room filled with mostly young filmmakers, and I wrapped up my discussion over there telling them, because they were wondering, who's going to save film going into the future. And I told them, I said, it's not Christopher Nolan. It's not Quentin Tarantino. It's not Spielberg. It's not me. It's all of you in this room, who have never shot film, who have that curiosity of what it can do, who have that desire to try something artistically different. And just 2 days ago, my former assistant, Tanya, texted me and she said, because she produces music videos, and she says, I want to start shooting these on film. How do I start that? What camera do I use? And, how do I start to learn this process? So it's this generation that's coming now, which is why it makes it so crucial for the film schools to teach it. And it's not going to stop the young filmmakers who really, 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 really want to shoot film, because they will find a way no matter what. But, if when film stays in the film program in a film school, it makes that tool immediately accessible so that people can explore, and that's important.
Totally. I think that's great, Michael.
Sage wisdom.
Steve, it's, if all these schools stop teaching film, Kodak Film School might be the next one. That on the plate.
I try and maintain a healthy ecosystem. So, we've kind of done exactly opposite of what the Silicon Valley companies have done. We've not tried to own every single part of the pathway. But what we have, because we want a healthy environment of lots of people supporting it. I look at it as, I'm the guy putting on the Academy Awards, but I want everyone else to be having a Vanity Fair party and a CAA party and to create this big thing. That being said, when something happens like the Atlanta lab was going out of business 3 years ago, we bought the lab. When New York didn't have a lab, we went in and built a lab. We'll be making an announcement very shortly about something we're doing similar here in LA. And so we're very good shepherds of the space, but we're not trying to be the complete owners of the space.
Awesome. Well, everyone, this was very informative. Hopefully everyone feels satisfied after this conversation. I'm curious if anyone has any final remarks before we close it up.
Shoot film, and thank you for shooting film on behalf of us.
Awesome.
If you ever have a chance to go to Rochester, New York, let me know. I'll hook you up. And the film factory is literally the eighth wonder of the industrialized world. You just cannot believe your eyes when you see what, the place is so big. There are 27 miles of train track on the grounds of the park. That's how big it is.
I would say my only piece of advice is if you want to have my career, don't be afraid, to shoot film. If you've never done it, grab a roll, shoot it, and literally your head will explode at the possibilities.
Christian, do you have any advice?
I think also shoot film stills if you can too. I think film stills are a great way to, if you're a film student and you're having a tough time, not learning enough, learning how to shoot film, I think stills is a super important thing. And I think, we've moved in the direction of digital still cameras so much culturally, but I think you can learn so much about film stocks and latitude and exposure and processing simply by, buying a cheap 35mm camera and shooting some rolls of your own. So.
That's great. Tehillah, any advice for the youngins?
Pave your own path. If you want to shoot on film and try and get work, that's kind of how I did it. Even though my school didn't always have the best resources for shooting on film, if you want to do it and really pursue career in cinematography, I think it's important to push for what you want and experiment, especially you have access to all these different tools.
Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you so much for your time. This was really meaningful today, and I appreciate what was said. I'm really excited to share this, and thank you again for being a part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.